of the public, the press and councillors and our staff. I'll commence the Urban Foreman Transport Development Committee for Thursday the 13th of February. Welcome to those who are watching us online. This is being live streamed, and I think we're all aware now of how we should speak into our mics and look at cameras and things. And also about cell phones, we've had that message consistently. Please have them all turned off. I would just add that if you have it on silent and it's vibrating madly on the table, it's just about as bad as it's ringing. So would you please stop it from doing that when it does ring. We have apologies for lateness for Councillor Hollis and Councillor Kiddy, who are due here, I think, in about 15 minutes or so. And we have Councillor Morris coming to us via phone. Are there any other apologies? Perhaps the Mayor is on his way, so we'll add an apology for the Mayor. Someone like to move those apologies? Thank you, Councillor Clout. Seconded, Councillor Arbery. All those in favour, please say aye. Against? It's carried. We have no public forum this morning. No late items that I'm aware of. Confidential business, there is none on the agenda today. And no real need to change the order of business, I don't think. We only have 2 items, though they are lengthy. They will proceed in that order. So we come to the confirmation of minutes, starting at page 9 of the agenda. The minutes of the Urban Foreman Transport Development Committee, 27th of November 2019. Are there any corrections there which need to be made?
Can he not hear us?
Councillor Morris, can you hear me? Thank you.
Councillor Morris, can you hear the chair? Think we take that as a no. Okay, so we're just dealing with the minutes now. There are quite a few pages of them. Are there any amendments or corrections that you wish to draw our attention to before we accept them? And then I will take matters arising from the minutes. There are none from what I tell. Okay, so would someone like to move they be accepted as a true and correct record? Thank you, Councillor Salisbury. Seconded, Councillor Arbery. All those in favour, please say aye. Against? That is carried. Now, before we move on, there is a tradition of having matters arising from the minutes. Are there any questions you wish to ask staff, and just to follow up from something that is in the minutes?
Yes, I have a question.
Yes, Councillor Hughes.
I'd just like to know, in terms of the Arataki safety audit for the B2B crossing, has the council looked at this, and are there any matters arising from it? Is there any concerns around what's happening with the temporary closing of the underpass?
Yeah, thank you. So there's been a safety audit done on the temporary closure. So we need to bear in mind that this temporary closure was always going to happen, regardless of the underpass staying in or going out or being replaced, or whatever the sort of the long-term solution is. And we've had some concerns about the signals for some time, and worked with the Transport Agency, and there are some differing professional road safety engineering opinions on this. The Transport Agency is getting advice from their designer that it is functioning well, or designed to function well, and the safety audit highlights some concerns about it. And we've looked at those, and actually we've been on site. We monitored it yesterday, and it's hard for us to see that anything could have been done different in terms of managing the temporary closure. There are some behavioural issues. People are running the red light. We don't. People do. I mean, that happens all the time. So what could be a concern here is that if it isn't voluntary, that has a sort of a consequential impact. If you run a red light because you don't see it, then there is a sort of a design issue. If you run a red light voluntary or try to, then it's an enforcement issue, and that's something probably the only thing we can do now is to advise the Transport Agency that if they could give the police a call and see if they can get some assistance to monitor that would be an improvement. But other than that, in terms of the mechanics and the layout, it's hard for us to see that they could have done anything much different.
Sorry, just for clarification, is it the cars running the red light or the pedestrians running
the red light, yeah.
Yeah.
Councillor Robson?
Yeah, following up Councillor Hughes' question, I've had reports that the crossing's actually being staffed. That's to say there are staff from someone, NZTA, TCC, actually operating the signalling system and supporting people going backwards and forwards. Now, one assumes that may be some attempt to mitigate risk. Is the intention to have it permanently staffed while it's operating, or is that just happening for now while sort of bedding it in?
Sorry, I couldn't tell you whether that's a long term, but I do know that we have people on site, and we're there for monitoring purposes, and Transport Agency has staff there for the purpose of assisting people and understanding the layout, and so it wouldn't be usual to keep that assistance long term, but I would have to check with the Transport Agency if that is their intention. I would be guessing otherwise.
You let us know.
Thank you. I can do that.
Thank you. Very good. So moving on our agenda, are there any declarations of conflicts of interest? Okay. So the first item, 8.1 on the agenda, I'll ask Andy Mead and whoever is accompanying him to come forward to present submissions to the draft National Policy Statement on Indigenous Biodiversity, the Resource Management Systems Reform and the Urban Development Bill.
Excuse me, Chair. And just to go back one, I just want to make sure that if there are, in terms of the conflicts, in terms of the register, that I'm registered down as a staff member employee for Boffa School.
Okay, just noted.
Yeah.
That's fine. Thank you. Ria?
Good morning, everyone. So just a quick introduction from us, and then we'll get into the three submissions that this paper covers. So the government has recently progressed policy making in three areas that affect planning and growth management, particularly in Tauranga. So those three areas are a comprehensive review of the current resource management system. So really looking whether the RMA is fit for purpose going forward. And that review at this stage is in a quite conceptual kind of think piece state. The second area is around its resource management rules around Indigenous biodiversity. So that's setting a national policy statement, national direction around those matters. So it has set out a draft national policy statement for comment. And the third is the Urban Development Bill. Now, the Urban Development Bill is the second piece of legislation in establishing Kāinga Ora, which is the government's urban development agency, which would take on large projects, particularly housing projects across the country. So what we're going to do is just quickly run through the key points of each of those submissions, starting with the resource management reforms. But firstly, just a little bit of background in terms of how we put these submissions together. I guess obviously we firstly focus on putting submissions in around key issues that might affect Tauranga City Council, issues particularly that might affect key issues in Tauranga like growth management. We work across the council, so it's not just my team putting these submissions in. We work across and take the views of the other teams within the councils, elected members of course. We work across other councils, both within the region and across New Zealand, particularly other growth councils, and other professional bodies such as LGNZ and SOLGUM. So we're really trying to put in well-rounded submissions that cover key points. Some circumstances we do bring in, I guess, independent experts in their fields. We did that around the freshwater management reforms last year, and this time around we've had some assistance in our Kāinga Ora urban development submission. So I just want to give you some assurance that we are really doing our best to identify key issues, because these proposals can have significant impacts on how we plan for the future of our city, and sometimes, as we know, policy instruments and legislation can have unintended effects or not quite hit the nail on the head. So we really want to identify issues and try and have them sorted out as legislation and policy is being made rather than retrospectively. But with that said, I'll just hand over to Brad Bellamy, who's going to, he was the key drafter of the submission around the resource management reform. He'll just go through the key issues and then we can talk through questions on that.
Well, and colleagues, what we'll do is deal with each issue, hear from the staff to report on the first one, questions afterwards. And so if you can note them down if you want to, please.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Brad Bellamy. What we'll cover just quickly is the Council's response to the issues and options paper that was released by the expert panel that's been put together by the government to carry out what they're referring to a comprehensive review of the resource management process. So it's not just the RMA, but more holistic, I guess, as well. So earlier last year, they put together this expert panel. They also invited stakeholders, key stakeholders, to input into the terms of reference, which this council did input into and raised a number of points that they thought the expert panel should be looking into. I think those weren't uncommon across the country, and they also were picked up and largely were touched on inside the issues and options paper. So the issues and options paper was released publicly in November, late November last year. It's a rather lengthy document, but that's not to be unexpected, really. It covered what they decided were 14 key issues. They covered a range of things from some of those key things we picked up and ran with in terms of our comments back to the panel on the issues and options paper. The ones that we chose to focus on included a legislative architecture, which is a interesting way of terming it, but effectively what they were saying was they're looking at one of the issues being that it appears that the RMA, for example, now has got caught up with trying to deliver urban outcomes, and then there's also the natural environment outcomes. And so one of the issues and one of the options they put forward was, should there be two pieces of legislation? So that's kind of one of the key points in the issues and options paper. But then moving through, there were things like whether the purpose and principles of the RMA are right, recognising the treaty of Waitangi as well, strategic integration across resource management system, which we'll just cover quickly, addressing climate change and natural hazards, which we felt was a key issue for Tauranga. National direction, which we also picked up on, especially given the last 12 to 18 months has been very busy time in terms of the number of national policy statements the government has been putting out in draft and trying to implement, including urban development bills and the like. And finally, the policy and planning framework. Now, that's only 7 of the issues, but one of the key things that the issues and options paper identified was that you can interlink a lot of those other 7 remaining issues with the ones that we've chosen to speak on. So we took that route in terms of preparing the submission, because we picked on these and then decided, well, there was a number of interrelated issues. So in terms of the first issue about legislative architecture, the other key thing about this was that this response to the issues and options paper was due on the 3rd of February. So we'll hear 2 other submissions documents today as well. One's due tomorrow, that's the Urban Development Bill, and one's due next month, and that's the response to the Indigenous Biodiversity Policy Statement. So there's been a range of different timings along the way. So just to clarify, this was a this was a response that we put together and that was sent out last Monday, okay, and back to the expert panel. So in terms of legislative architecture, and that was talking about whether, for example, the RMA should be split up. The response to that was we didn't consider that was actually necessary, but we certainly thought there was going to have to be better clarity and again, to start linking into some of the national direction issues that we felt that were in play here, that we considered that there would need to be greater clarity and refinement around some of the national direction documents that are being prepared. One of the key issues is there doesn't seem to be a clear hierarchy to those importance of those documents, and for for a city like ours, which we are trying to manage, as we'll hear shortly, the importance of protection of biodiversity versus growth issues, they start to compete. And whilst the ministry report to us that it's a balancing act, it's more than just that. They start actually competing with one another, and so that can be quite complex. So we encourage the panel to turn their mind further to that. We thought that creating greater integration between various legislative frameworks that local government must operate, so not just the RMA, but making it clear how those things sit with Local Government Act, for example, was very, very important. Alongside that was the Building Act. Now, as we move more into a natural hazards sort of and climate change type environment, the importance of the Building Act and the RMA working together was something, or better working together, was something that we also touched on through this submission. In terms of the purpose and principles of the RMA itself, we didn't consider they require significant change, but we did emphasise that we thought that it would be beneficial to have some clarity between, provide clarity on where the importance of infrastructure and housing and urban development sits, because at the moment that's not clear in the RMA, not in terms of a matter of national importance. So where there's other things that that are. We supported the ongoing role of engagement with tangata whenua in terms of the treaty as well, in terms of the issue 3 that we've identified. But we also put in there that whilst engagement is critical, being able to have those areas well resourced is key, because otherwise it's the stretching of resource across those areas can be quite difficult. So we certainly pushed that as well. So one of the other key things that comes through the issues and options paper is the whole idea of spatial planning. Now, spatial planning, in our view, is really, really critical and important, but it's not legislatively mandated at the moment. So we felt that if there was going to be anything that should happen through the RMA, is actually making it clear that spatial planning has some real purpose and it can achieve some great things. But at the moment, it sits there and it then becomes something that people can push to the side and move on with other things. And a lot of work can go into spatial planning, a lot of community involvement can go into spatial planning. But if those things can only sit on the side and not become part of a future decision-making process, then, or even a decision-making framework, then it can be complicated. So we certainly supported the idea that spatial planning become something that's legislatively mandated. Addressing climate change. Yes, we certainly thought that was an important, but having direction from a national direction on what that looks like, we felt is absolutely critical. Having what we referred to as a holistic response to natural hazards, rather than requiring regional and local responses, whilst are important, there's no guiding overarching framework to that, and that's something that we felt that this reform should certainly look at. National direction I kind of covered already, but the big point here was the competing nature. We use the word competing rather than balancing, but the competing nature of some of those national direction at the moment, and trying to get in a space where at the moment those national policy statements coming out very directive in terms of even to the point of listing potentially what rules you go down. Now that's quite, for a policy statement, that's quite a directive approach, and it can sometimes be an obstacle to trying to move forward. And finally, policy and planning framework. The big point from our submission really, or our response back to the panel, was trying to better enable district plan changes has to be a focus, because at the moment they tend to take too long. And it certainly was something that we picked up on. We thought that being able to bring into play these spatial planning frameworks, being able to say, well, let's work on this, and then and hopefully enable those changes to happen more quickly and more efficiently. Was certainly a key point moving forward. And finally, we just wanted to make sure that the panel realised that as a local authority, we consider ourselves a key stakeholder and wanted to be involved in further engagement on these reforms.
Thank you, Brad. So, open to questions. Councillor Arbery.
Not specifically on the submission, but generally when we do these submissions, do you go down to, assume, Wellington and submit to the panel verbally?
In this instance, I don't know whether that opportunity was made available to submitters. At this point in time, the timeline, as I understand it, is to prepare a final report to the ministry by June this year. I think from June there'll be opportunity for further engagement with stakeholders, including local government, and there will be a process from there in terms of presentation. It comes particularly into play when they get to the point of drafting sort of national direction, where that more formal presentation of a submission can be done verbally.
Quickly, more generally, in terms of the national policy statements, we're not seemingly having the opportunity to present at hearings, so they're taking written submissions but not enabling that. In terms of the legislative process, like the Urban Development Bill, that'll go through a select committee process, so there is the opportunity to speak to submissions at that point. Often we do. It just depends on the issues. In terms of the Urban Development Bill, that's one that we would certainly consider going and speaking to.
I would expect if this gets to a bill, it'll be a nationwide road sort of thing with submissions everywhere. I'd say I wouldn't have to go to Wellington, but they're still early stages, aren't they? Other questions? Yes, Councillor Robson, then Kiokawi.
Yeah, this is sort of a bit of a standard one, but paragraph 13 in the report, this report does not raise any issues of significance. My question needs framing. This report, on reading it, raises, in my view, significant issues. The biggest one being the fact that without a hierarchy, the conflicts between all these statements makes our job almost impossible. There is nonsense in here. For instance, the resourcing of tangata whenua to participate in these things, it is suggested, will be addressed by collaboration. Well, collaboration has never been a substitute for proper resourcing. So my question is this: how do we get to a point where we respond to these issues, sort of, if you like, line by line, raising significant overall problems around their non-compatibility, the fact that you can't reconcile them, there's no way of actually working with these, the resource implications, but we wind up with paragraph 13 in the report that says this report does not raise any issues of significance? Because to me it flags.
I'll ask Christine to respond to that, because it's more of a standard part of any report, really.
So it's an issue in terms of the significance policy of council. So it's not saying that these matters are not significant in the broader context. It's when you go through the assessment process that sits in the significance policy, which then also leads to whether or not it's appropriate for council to make decisions without going to public consultation or not. And when do the public get involved in matters? So that's really what that's referring. It is misleading. We've had that conversation many times. It's the way the Local Government Act is framed in terms of the significance policy. Totally agree with you that these matters are of significance. In terms of how we manage that, we are raising these holistic linkages between all the documents and the fact that there is no hierarchy, that they're all done in isolation of each other with no cross-consideration. We have been successful in another area, which is in the water space, the NPS on water, where we, together with Auckland, Hamilton, Queenstown, wrote a letter to say this has been done in isolation and doesn't in particular align with the NPS urban development. For growth councils, this is a substantive matter and it doesn't fit with the government's growth agenda. And we asked to have a separate session with them, and they've agreed to that, and that was held earlier in the week. So there are mechanisms that we are actively working with to try to get the government's attention and the ministerial staff's attention on the implications of these issues for growth councils in particular, in trying to deliver growth, urban development across our sub-region, as well as trying to meet each of these requirements, and the two do not add up. And so we'll continue to do that. I suppose what I'm trying to do is give you some level of confidence that we are trying really hard, but it is difficult.
I appreciate that. I'm happy to raise it with my colleagues at an informal meeting tomorrow, but it is misleading when public read reports and skim down them and see something like that.
It does sound like you've got a very good speech coming, so we'll look forward to hearing. Pio Kawe.
Kia ora, Mr. Chair. My question and issue around the submission. First of all, I think it's very extensive and covers off some of a lot of the issues that this committee and city are grappling with, and responding back at a national level around these issues. My question to you really is that we've been talking around issue 3 around the treaty. When we're talking around the issue that's been raised around resourcing for tangata whenua and their engagement, is that I think it may have been a good opportunity to include into the submission the work that we're currently doing. I think that there's a value in adding to the submission around the number of iwi management plans that we have within Tauranga City that identify these issues as being significant to tangata whenua. So I think we could have added to issue number 3, and that those two issues, in terms of that we have a standing committee, we have Te Rangapūmana Whenua o Tauranga Moana, and it would have been good to put into the submission around an engagement program moving forward, and clearly that Hapu and iwi have been putting forward these issues around urban form, biodiversity, wetlands, the moana in terms of two iwi harbour management plans, the recent plans that have been developed just last year in terms of Ngā Pōtiki and their issue, but all of the plans that have been, it would have been good, I think, to support the issue of the treaty, and working with tangata whenua around raising those issues in the submission.
A response for that?
I think those are good comments. Obviously, the submission has now had to be lodged, so we're in a position where we can't make any changes to that. I think one of the issues for us is just the tight timeframes of trying to turn these things around, and the ability to have that time to engage with tangata whenua and others in terms of putting this together as a constraint. But looking forward, we'll certainly take those comments on board.
Just one further comment, just to follow up with that. I know timeframes are tight, but we do have a Takawaenga unit, and that while they don't speak on behalf of Hapu and Iwi, I think they probably would have raised issues that I've just raised, so that they could have been included.
we were engaging with Taka Wāinga in terms of putting this submission together. So yes, we have put an effort into it.
Any further questions on this issue? I have a couple. Just in regard to that national direction on national hazards, we heard yesterday of the impact of the regional council's regional policy statement on us. So sometimes, though, we might get worse than we thought, from a national policy statement. Do you think it would be best to have a standard across? I know in terms of climate change, which was the second question, really, we wouldn't be then tossed here and there by one council that declares a climate emergency and another that doesn't. We would get some kind of a standard response. But is there danger in it being imposed nationally in that regard when there are very different circumstances around the country where we should maybe deal with them more locally?
It's one of the key points we make in the national direction section under that issue is that we felt that the national policy statements are almost, there is a number of mechanisms under the RMA currently that this national direction can be pushed through the country. One is through policy statements, the other is through national environmental standards. And those national environmental standards are supposed to be very rule-based and prescribe, when resource consents are required and what should be considered, etc. And sometimes these national policy statements are going to that depth. So the point that we are trying to make in here is that there is a place for national policy statements, but maybe their purpose and what's actually been put inside some of these national policy statements should be very carefully considered because they are being rolled out nationally and they don't always reflect local regional issues. So it was a balance between the points you're making, recognising that when not done well, they have big impacts locally and regionally, but we're asking for a bigger reflection on some of the drafting of those because the court's also getting hold of them and saying, oh, no, we interpret that different, and that can really cause some issues.
What we're seeing specifically on the hazards issue is quite significant variability across the country and how different regions and local authorities are dealing with that issue and where they've set the bar in terms of how much risk is acceptable. And perhaps in the Bay of Plenty we might have set that bar quite high compared to some other regions that, just naturally you might think are more at risk to natural hazards. And we're just saying, well, we're not sure this is quite right. We're obviously engaging with the regional council about it, but we think it would be very good for the government to turn its mind to it in terms of a national policy and direction, have a really good debate about it so we can set things at the right level across the country. So that, it's much more efficient if you do it once rather than do it, I'm not sure how many regional councils there are, but say 20 times across the country. And we can have that debate around what are the impacts of, if we set the bar here, what does that mean for urban development and house prices and a range of matters.
My last question, Andy, is how long do we expect this process of RMA review to be? And what sort of environment does that create for you and your team and our need to go through plan changes here? Is it problematic?
Look, this is going to be a long process, and will obviously be dependent on outcomes and perhaps this upcoming election and maybe the next one. So I expect this to be going on for a long time. Eventually it will end up in a legislative process. So, and again, we're probably a number of years away from an amended RMA or a replacement bill or bills being put before Parliament to consider. What it means for us is that it is quite an uncertain environment, so we have to notify our next district plan review, the full review of the district plan, in approximately 4 years' time. And we have this sort of hanging over our heads in the sense that the RMA might not exist or it might be quite different by the time we get there. But if we don't start that process now, we'll never get there in 4 years. So there's a lot of uncertainty, but we'll just have to work with what we've got at the moment, and we'll have to be adaptive and move as things change over time.
Okay, we'll just pause as we try one more number to get hold of Councillor Morris to bring him in, and then we'll go on to the next topic of the presentation, which is the biodiversity, I think, is it, Andy? It's biodiversity next. It's on page 24. C is the issue in the agenda. With your indulgence, I will amend the motion on the apologies to include Councillor Morris as an apology, since we've been unable to make a connection there. Is that okay with everybody? Thank you. So Andy, back to you for the next presentation, please.
Well, I'd just like just to introduce Steve Tuck. So Steve is also on my team. Steve sits under Janine. Speedy, who's at the back there, and so Steve and Brad have put the work into our submission on the draft national policy statement for Indigenous biodiversity, and I'll just let Steve cover kind of the key points around what is this actually aiming at, what's the purpose of this policy statement, and kind of what are the key issues that we've submitted on.
Okay. Good morning, everybody. So, the National Policy Statement for Indigenous Biodiversity. This document is a high-level national policy document, sits underneath the RMA. It's been prepared by the Department of Conservation and the Ministry for the Environment, and it's been prepared in conjunction with a biodiversity collaborative group made up of Federated Farmers, Forest and Bird Society, central government iwi advisors and other parties. So the purpose of the NPS is to prevent and reverse a perceived decline in New Zealand's Indigenous biodiversity. The document is premised that on the basis that studies by Statistics New Zealand and various other government departments have identified that there's a significant decline in Indigenous biodiversity, both flora and fauna, across the country. So the policy statement seeks to reverse that decline and create gains in Indigenous biodiversity through various mechanisms. It's based on a philosophy at section 1.7 of the policy statement, which is a philosophy termed Hutia Te Rito, which is, I think, boiled down into a concise fashion, is essentially that human society and the environment are integrally interlinked, and that if biodiversity isn't protected and helped to flourish, then society will also suffer. So I guess the core tenets of the NPS are that it requires all local authorities, regional councils and local councils to carry out district-wide, and it'll be on a district-by-district basis, but nationwide surveys of Indigenous biodiversity to identify what's significant and what is less significant, and to categorise those areas or those features as significant, categorised as Category 1 and Category 2, and then to survey and identify various other features of significance as well, such as biodiversity that might be considered to be taonga species, or areas where highly mobile fauna, such as migratory birds, nest and roost and breed. So it requires those surveys to be carried out by local authorities across their entire districts. It also requires regional councils to work with the local authorities to carry out and implement regional biodiversity strategies. In doing all of that survey work, the level of detail required is pretty enormous, because many of the concerns I've raised in the submission is about the ambiguity and the breadth of the policy statement. It seems to require and I'll carry on with other aspects of it in a moment, but as a broad principle, the surveys that seem to be required at almost every taxonomic level of life, from potentially microbes and fungi up to mammals and birds. So you can imagine, just as a first step to actually carry out those surveys to identify what is going to be an enormous task for councils to carry out. Once the councils have surveyed and identified what they consider to be significant and not significant, they need to carry out plan changes to identify those and map those areas, and to implement rules in their district plans and regional plans to protect those areas. We're also required by planning methods in the district plan and regional plan to restore and enhance certain areas. So, for example, the policy statement requires places like formal wetlands and wetlands, biodiversity corridors to be protected and managed, and it also requires, obviously, as the gentleman over there mentioned before, consultation with tangata whenua to identify what may be significant to tangata whenua in terms of taonga species, and to work with tangata whenua to, on an individual basis, council by council, to work out what methods are we going to use to protect the taonga, how are we going to monitor that, and I think that is another fundamental point for this district, with so many iwi and hapu groups who will have clear interest in this matter, to work out a consistent means of implementing that requirement. So, all in all, I think what I've tried to do in the submission, it's an extremely complex document, and if you drill down too far into the rabbit hole, you just get lost. There's a lot of what-ifs and maybes in this document. There's quite a lot of uncertainty. So what we tried to do in the document is to give some examples relevant to this council area, but notwithstanding that, there'll be plenty of other issues where the answer is really, the policy statement could require this to be carried, it could require a certain effort to be carried out in one particular manner, or it might require it to be carried out in another manner. 2 weeks ago, I had a meeting with representatives from the MFE and the Department of Conservation, including the MFE staffer who actually wrote the MPS. I was there with staff members from Whakatane District Council, Taupo, Rotorua, Kawerau and Western Bay. And I think councils were, by and large, singing from the same song sheet in terms of just the significant ambiguity in the document, and about the what-ifs and maybes, and if this, then that, or perhaps if this, then that. Much of the response we got from the MFE was really sort of reflected, I think, something that Mr. Bellamy mentioned before about the lack of integration between national planning instruments. So we raised, for example, the conflicts between perhaps this biodiversity statement, which requires biodiversity to be protected and maintained, versus the proposed national policy statement for urban development, which requires us to provide for growth. And I think the answer from MFE was really, that would make a good submission point. So what as I say, we've tried to sort of boil it down into a concise fashion in this submission, and it's also to say as well that I think at the front of the submission it says that council is certainly not opposed in principle to the idea of maintaining and enhancing biodiversity. In fact, we already do so. We've got approximately 550 hectares of significant ecological areas mapped and managed. This national policy statement would not enable a straight translation from what we currently have to the new paradigm. So we're going to have to rework what we already have, as well as capture whatever else is out there that we maybe don't know about, or that will be raised by parties to the process. So really, in a nutshell, central government appears to be bringing in a policy statement at a national level that will apply to everybody, regardless of what amount of investment your council has made into biodiversity management and protection. different councils will have, it's acknowledged in the background documentation that different councils have different levels of effort invested into biodiversity management. We obviously have quite a lot, other councils have none, and it almost seems that we would be facing a significant opportunity cost in terms of having done the work up front over the last 2 decades to protect and maintain significant areas versus other councils that have done nothing and now can just pick this document up afresh and run with that. That's probably an overview of the document. I think it's probably better to perhaps just go through questions to discuss some of the detail that people might have questions about.
Thank you, Steve. Yes, Councillor Hollis, Councillor Hughes, Councillor Clouch.
So given that we've done a whole pile of work on this and that there is some upcoming, let's call them alterations, sometimes it's worth doing best practice. Has what we've done so far, could we consider that best practice compared to the new document, and is it worth having that fight? What I mean is, do we keep going down a pathway that seems to be working pretty well, that puts us ahead of the game, so that we can revert back to something that may not be as ideal?
And that's the exact nub of it. I think that we would be potentially replacing something that is working with something that has so much uncertainty loaded into it that perhaps we'd be taking a step backwards.
What are the consequences of continuing down our pathway and trying just to fit the bits that fit to tick those boxes?
So what we do currently is that we have, as I mentioned, 500 plus hectares mapped. Not all of that is managed, much of it is, but it's incrementally, as funds become available and are budgeted, new areas are incrementally brought in and managed and upgraded. So the benefit of that is that we can obviously have some certainty around long-term budgeting, whereas under the proposed MPS, it seems to be really everything at once, do a plan change within about 5 years to lock everything in. It doesn't seem to really allow for a staged approach.
No, we're not, but I'll ask Christine to respond to that. I think it's a worthwhile point.
So, no, national policy statements we're required to give effect to, so you can't ignore. Our best opportunity is trying to influence the development and framing of that, which is exactly the process that we're doing here. So that's why these submission processes are really, really important, to put them in with some quality and credibility, and attending, as Steve talked about, those forums where the MFE, the staff who draft this actual policy statement can listen to the sector and hear the issues. So for them, it's not a good situation if a policy statement comes out and then there's a lot of difficulty in implementing it. So best influencing now.
I think Brad has a comment too.
I was just going to say that the other, depending which way you want to look at it, the other complication with this MPS is also the requirement to revisit every 2 years. So once you've gone through and remapped using a new methodology, setting aside a city plan review, every 2 years you'll have to go through and just check that you haven't missed anything or something new hasn't been recreated, or in fact you haven't, as through a resource consent process, required someone to do some work to a wetland, and that actually will be recognised now as a significant natural area. Now, on the face of it, that's to probably be commended, but the realities around trying to then run a change process and adopting that through what we were just referring to can be sometimes a lengthy plan change process is a complication. Yeah.
All right, just let Christine make another general comment, please.
I think what you're seeing here in what, in terms of this issue, but also the matters that were being raised before, like natural hazards, the difficulty is that there are policies being developed and rules being developed, but they're not developed by the people who actually need to implement them at the end of the day. And what we have is real practical experience about trying to make these things happen on the ground and giving effect to them, and the costs and resources and time and the outcome implications that it may have. And so I think that's That's the issue that we have here across many of these things. So we try really hard to bring that practical layer and lens to things, but it does happen across at a national level, it happens at a regional level, and it happens at a local sub-regional level, and you'll hear more of this over the next few months because there are a number of matters that fall into this type of category.
All right, next question, Councillor Hughes.
I have a couple of questions. Can I ask what team you're on? Yes. City planning team. Yep. And so this is the biodiversity strategy, and you've made some quite big assumptions here, and I about biodiversity and what we're doing ourselves as a council. Do we have any evidence to show? You said that we are doing quite a lot, and we're doing a lot more than other councils. From my from what I've seen around the country, we're actually doing quite little compared to other councils. Can you tell me where your evidence has come from on this one?
So the background documentation to the MPS actually sets out what councils at a high level have done so far. So in terms of what the effects of implementation would be. And I don't remember the numbers exactly, but it was around the range of, I think it was approximately 40% of councils have no significant environmental or ecological mapping or protection measures in their district plans, and another roughly 25% have somewhat done some work around it, but only, I think it was in the range of about 15 to 20% that actually have district plan provisions and rules and frameworks as evolved as Tauranga does. So that's in the background documentation to the actual MPS itself. That's part of the Section 32 evaluation report.
Microphone, please.
We only have 4%, is that right, and which is one of the lowest areas in the country that we would have to show any kind of signs of protection in?
So the 4% number is the area that's currently mapped as significant ecological areas. So those are the areas that would definitely become protected under the new national policy statement, and as well as that we would have to then obviously carry out the rest of the survey and to find out what else qualifies to go in. And because of the broad nature of the assessment criteria that the ecologist would have to use, it seems like a lot of land would be in.
The concern I have too around looking at the submission is that there doesn't, one, seem to be any inclusion of the perspective of tangata whenua, and two, there doesn't seem to be any perspective from our natural habitats team to show exactly what their perspective is of at-risk flora and fauna here. From what I've heard from that team is that we have a lot of at-risk biodiversity components in our city, so it's no small problem for them to try and look at how to protect them.
So the areas that are already mapped as being significant in the current district plan would cover probably many of the areas that the people you've spoken to are concerned about, and they're protected for a reason, obviously, because the biodiversity there is under threat or in decline. In preparing the document, we've spoken with senior ecological consultants to talk about at the more higher level, I suppose, nationwide situation, as well as bringing it down to what's happening in Tauranga. At a high level, the answer we got was that rather than people actually going out and cutting down trees or poisoning native species, a bigger issue is weed and pest invasion, which is actually weed and pest controllers work that's already been undertaken by various community groups and other agencies. And there's a question as to whether actually that work might be compromised by the proposed MPS, because funding would potentially be diverted from those works to trying to survey and map and manage all of these other features.
I see Janine has moved to a microphone to make a comment also, I think, in relation. Would you?
Yeah, sorry, just in addition to your question around tangata whenua. So I presented to the Tarangapu Mana Whenua or Tauranga Moana in December on both the RMA comprehensive review and the proposed NPS on Indigenous biodiversity, provided them with an overview of what this means for them and highlighted if there was anything that they wanted us to raise through our submission, and also really encourage them to make their own submission, and that's sitting with that group at the moment. Thank you.
Okay. Councillor Clout?
Yeah, look, thanks very much for your presentation. You mentioned that you got together with other Bay of Plenty councils. To what extent are we liaising with the regional council, and what's their view on this whole thing, and what part are they going to be playing, particularly in the response to this proposed MPS? Thank you.
So, Regional Council have circulated a draft submission to us and to other BOP local authorities. At a high level, I think the draft submission was supportive, but identifying a few questions. So, for example, the question around local authorities having to provide a minimum of 10% coverage of Indigenous biodiversity within urban areas, and that area, the delineation of that area, has to be set by Regional Council. So Regional Council, for example, were asking, how do we set the 10%? What's urban, what's non-urban? That draft submission was circulated about a month ago, and obviously 2 weeks ago we actually met with central government representatives. And at that meeting, I think the tone of Regional Council officers was a little bit different in terms of perhaps maybe having more time to reflect on the policy statement, because there were, acknowledgement of the significant kind of implementation difficulties, both at local and regional level for everybody involved. They are continuing to draft their submission. They haven't lodged it yet, and they're going to circulate a second draft, I think, in the potentially next week, actually.
So you feel that they will have a more nuanced approach to their submission now that they've had discussions with the local authorities? Based on
Pretty lengthy comment by the manager at BOPRC responsible for it, I think so, yeah.
I wondered if I could, do you have a question, Councillor? I'll just do this and then I'll come to you. I just wondered if I can drill into a little bit more the paragraph about the 4%, because when I read it, there was 520 hectares of conservation zone land, and then there's 43 recorded significant ecological areas, and there's another 500 hectares, but it says some of that is in the other. And then it talks about that excludes the areas located within the harbour, given that our territorial authority includes this harbour, that the boundaries of that, or the edges of that, must be quite a big area too, given mangroves and other things. So this 4% could actually be more when we got to it, but we don't know. Is that the general sort of flavour, or?
So what we did was, because the national policy statement isn't the urban areas, or the extent of the relevance of the national policy statement isn't going beyond the coastal into the coastal marine area. So what we've currently mapped in our district plan, for example, is significant ecological areas that include areas inside the harbour. So we had to do a bit of an exercise of going, well, we could just map what we've got in terms of significant ecological areas, but it might not be comparing apples with apples for the purpose of the MPS. So what we did is we drilled it back, and so we have two categories currently, category 1 and 2, significant ecological areas, and we arrived at the at that 552. So what that means, though, is that that's currently our mapped significant ecological areas by themselves, making up 4%. There may be other areas that will sit within our conservation zones, within some of our other layers in our district plan, our important amenity landscape areas, that also, using this methodology, would fall into it, would potentially lift that. But there will be, I suspect, given what Steve has alluded to here in terms of the breadth of this methodology, we are looking, as an example, at banks within the lakes, for example, where native plants have been planted and gifted to council, which will turn into significant natural areas. Now, the implications of something like that would be that with a rule framework that this policy statement is then imposed, it'll be very difficult for us to actually get in there and do work if we need to do work in some of those areas. So well, I don't think that's what they intended to try and do, but the way things are worded at the moment, that makes it quite difficult to try and manage into the future. So yes, we could end up with a heck of a lot more, which might be good, but might not be so good. Yeah.
Would it potentially affect our dune protection if we discovered a dotterel in there or something like that, and then it becomes a protected area? Or
Well, given that dotterel is use the right terminology, endangered species list, then absolutely it'll become, and that again is some of the complications with not only significant natural areas but identifying areas of highly mobile fauna. Those areas aside will have to also be identified and protected as well. So yes, and acknowledging a lot of our dune system at the moment already sits inside ecological areas. Not all of it does, but some of it does. There is certainly the potential for others to come into that.
Councillor Arbery?
Just trying to summarise it at a high level. So our submission is basically, this is a good idea, it would improve biodiversity, but it would be extremely expensive and make our job difficult. And I suppose I've been in this situation before where I've had to apply for a resource consent in a significant ecological zone, but just down the road it was a permitted activity, but the ecologist said there were critically endangered frogs there. So I suppose this national policy statement is trying to address that scenario. And how well would it fix that?
I'm not sure if I'd quite go to the extent of saying that it's at a high level. The idea of protection of Indigenous biodiversity is one to be commended, and it's in fact it's something that this council has made a genuine attempt to. It's followed over a number of years. The last time we went through a district plan review, we followed the regional policy statement methodology, which was nationally recognised in terms of identification of ecological areas. We went through and we followed that process. What this is trying to, at a high level, do is recognise that across the country, not every council is doing this. And there are some councils that have done nothing, yet they are sitting in areas that have very extensive Indigenous biodiversity, and there needs to be some work done. In saying that, there are also areas that have identified Indigenous biodiversity, but perhaps their rule frameworks don't quite go far enough to protect them, don't place the value on it that they should do. So that's what this is what this MPS is trying to address at a high level. It's also addressing at a high level. So whilst it is something that again there is some technical detail in here in terms of the delivery of such a policy statement that makes that kind of complicated at a local level for a council like ourselves, who are trying to grapple with a number of other issues as well in terms of growth, for example, but also recognising that we have identified quite a large amount of Indigenous biodiversity. One of the key things that the regional council have identified is that there should be, and it's part of their draft submission at the moment, I don't think this will change, is that there should be perhaps an incremental step towards 10%. Because in reality, we've got to drill that down and look at the local settings of some of these areas and go, well, at this point, this is a good start, and maybe over many years there's a progression towards 10% or something. But just to jump straight in there at 10%, that can be very problematic.
Okay, if there's no more questions, we'll move on to the next item, which is perhaps loosely entitled the bulldozer that's coming. In comparison to the other two issues we've dealt with. I think Campbell Larking's coming to join Andy at the table.
Good morning, everyone. The bulldozer, interesting. So the purpose of the submission that's in front of us is that the government, following the creation of the Kaingaroa Homes and Communities Bill, which disestablished a range of government departments, Housing New Zealand, etc., and put it into Kaingaroa, they have now come up with a bill which is about creating specified development projects, SDPs, for my submission, and that's around trying to create a framework of improving the delivery of urban communities, essentially housing. It provides Kaingaroa with a toolkit of a range of powers that largely councils have, but developers might want, and then allows once you create a specified development project, the ability for Kaingaroa to then take that project, roll it out, or provide for the planning of it, not actually the delivery of it, but the rolling out of it. And some of our issues with the bill is that while we support it, it is one of the options that could be used to delivering your urban growth agenda. It has a potential range of implications for the council. One is that it's not strictly written into the bill that we would be a partner, a true partner in the project, while we're part of the promotion of the specified development project. It doesn't mean that we will actually be part of that project throughout the life of it. And then there are a range of other implications that flow on from that, being that the Kaingaroa can actually set their own development contributions regime or potentially be exempt from that. And you will understand the role and the need for development contributions in funding your infrastructure and your growth. 2, they can actually set rates, direct the council to develop bylaws, and also they can design and specify their own infrastructure standards, which automatically get vested in the council. And the main issue with that is we have our infrastructure development code, and we need to ensure that the infrastructure that is vested in council meets that code, because we rely on it, one, for the delivery of that community, and also the resilience of that community, so we don't need undersized or underinvested infrastructure. So the pathway we've gone down is we have written, I suppose, quite a comprehensive submission, one dealing in the front of the submission with the overall core issues that I've just outlined, and then we've really gone through detailed clauses and submitted on some of those key issues more specifically in changes. One other one I need to bring to your attention that I'd like to add into the submission is around the targeted rates. We've actually done a little bit of thinking after we've put the submission on the agenda, and we recognise that if we are going to have to potentially be in a regime where we have to take on the targeted rate and the collection of that, we need to be able to charge an administration fee for that, and that Kaingaroa, if they're going to set a target rate, needs to actually have deadlines in place to be able to inform us of that, so that we can put it into our wider planning and rates regime. Okay, so you comfortable with my overview? Thank you, sir.
Just a couple of extra points, not majors, but one thing that we did identify is that potentially the Kaingaroa toolkit, as we can call it, it maybe lacks a few tools in the tool belt. So there's no particular powers there to deal with the problems that existing land covenants may create in terms of providing for roads and services through adjoining land, or covenants that simply prohibit further development of land, and also dealing with leasehold interests in land. So there are provisions around acquiring land through a Public Works Act type compulsory acquisition process, but no processes to deal with some of those interests in land. And also a key issue that the way the bill has been set up and the process that must be followed is extensive. It would be at best probably an 18-month process, if not much longer, to establish a development project. So it's probably not going to be particularly suited to small and medium-sized developments, and we know around council there are, around Tauranga there are some opportunities of that scale, they lack at the moment the ability for council to progress them for one reason or another. So we were hopeful that this process might provide some of those opportunities.
Okay, questions? Pio Kawe?
Morena, kia ora, Kim. I just wanted to ask the question around the submission deal with the issue, two questions. Does it deal with the issue of multi-land Māori land within Tauranga City Council? And secondly, do we have figures around the amount of multi-land Māori land under each of the zones within Tauranga City Council?
Sorry, I don't have an answer to the second question at all. So I can say that quite conclusively, sorry. But the bill doesn't actually deal with really multi-land Māori land. It essentially says that the provisions of the Te Ture Whenua Act apply, which ultimately rules out this really being able to be utilised within Māori land. We have submitted within our the submission that we think that there should be some thinking around that, because Kaingaroa could partner with trusts to improve the way in which development can roll out around Tauranga, and that's not just into Timu, that's on all Māori land around Welcome Bay, Papakoinga housing, etc. So we think that there is an opportunity that should be reconsidered within the drafting of the bill, so we've put that into our submission.
I absolutely agree. And we've raised the issue directly with Kāinga Ora around opportunities of working in joint venture opportunities for housing opportunities, because clearly I heard yesterday one of the issues that was raised at the hui yesterday morning was around housing affordability. This addresses one of those.
Christine?
Just in terms of the Maori land, as part of the AFTI projects, there's been what's been described as constraints mapping, so where there are limitations on land, either because of the physical nature of the land or the ownership of the land. And my recollection is that the Maori land ownership, and I'm just looking at Andy to check I've got this right, has been included in that mapping process. So it is there across the whole of the sub-region, and all you'd need to do is to then overlay your zonings and pull out the quantums that relate to multiplayer on Maori land.
It's good. It was a request I made last year.
I can link you with the person at the Regional Council who has all of that data. So it's held by the Regional Council on behalf of the Smart Growth Partnership.
Whilst others are thinking of questions, I've got a couple. Campbell, the targeted rate issue, is that like the lakes special targeted rate they had for increased amenity that you're addressing with the administration fee, or is it a targeted rate a la the way of recovering infrastructure costs and stuff?
It essentially is far-reaching, so it doesn't specifically specify what it is, so it could be either or. Yeah, and I think that's a perfectly acceptable way of dealing with both issues. The main issue for us would be if it's set and we are the collectors of it, we are the ones that end up fronting that targeted rate, and therefore we are the ones responsible for the collection of that, and that has a cost.
Second question is about the covenants, which obviously is a problem. It just sort of takes my breath away that, you know, how could they be given those kind of powers? It's like, is there a mechanism? Is anyone, you know, you just can't get rid of those things. How would you go about giving Kāinga Ora the power to just ignore a covenant that's been established?
So there is a process at the moment, a High Court process, I believe, to seek to amend or remove a covenant. So that's not necessarily always going to be successful. And also, if you go through that process, even if you are successful, you may need to pay compensation to those that the covenant was set up to benefit. There's quite a well-publicised case just recently up in Pokeno, where I believe Synlait built a milk factory, invested many tens of millions of dollars in a milk factory on a piece of land that did have a covenant on it, saying it couldn't be used for industrial development on the basis of a High Court decision that covenant could be amended. That was further appealed to the Court of Appeal and overturned that decision, and the covenant stands, so it is very difficult. And the milk powder plant milk factory is built. So anyway, that's a problem for those people. So it is quite a difficult, can be quite a difficult process, quite a bit of risk, and obviously cost to get through there. But it is, look, covenants are a really key issue in our city. Covenants have been prevalent since the 1990s. Typically, in residential subdivisions, they prevent further subdivision and prevent more than one dwelling being built on a site. The city's basically doubled in size since 1990, so covenants affect half of our city. Some of those covenants have gone further, and they prevent land being used for the provision of services or access to adjoining land. So even if you go through a public works acquisition process to acquire a piece of land to connect an existing road to a new development site, you may not be able to use that land for that purpose of road. And there's a very, I guess, well-known example around, I guess, the previous council up in Ohawiti, where around 200 homes are constrained because of that particular issue, and that is a matter that we have set out in our submission and we've been making these points for some time to various processes and government agencies, but not getting much traction on this issue. There's a recent report in Auckland from Auckland Council around covenants and how they affect Auckland, and it's also a significant issue up there and in other parts of other growth cities around New Zealand.
Thank you. So generally, you can remove some covenants, if not all, with the owner's permission through the courts and so on. So I guess maybe a Public Works kind of power that says if someone won't sign, you can force them to take some compensation, but you probably have compensation attached to it. I think you alluded to that. So in that sense, it does start to make some sense. Other questions? Okay, well, I want to thank you, Andy, and Campbell, and Steve, and Brad, still here, for your presentations, and Janine, of course. Enormous amount of work, just making submissions, or present. Some of them aren't submissions because they're not bills yet, but just doing this work, particularly over the holidays, and you get these three conflicting kind of things. So I appreciate all that has gone on. We'll move to the actual recommendations now on page 21, and can have a debate on the issues if members wish to speak and address any of these. The recommendations are that we receive the submission on the issues and options paper for the RMA systems reform, that we endorse the draft submission on the National Policy Statement for Indigenous Biodiversity, and we endorse the draft submission on the Urban Development Bill for submission to that select committee. Do I have a mover? Okay, Councillor Hollis, and a seconder, Councillor Robson. You wish to speak, Councillor Hollis?
The only thing I really want to say is I think we should give these guys as much help as we can in this.
You mean our staff, or? Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Councillor Robson.
Reserve.
Any other speakers? I will venture a few comments. Were you indicating you wanted to speak, Councillor Hughes? It is interesting that these three pieces, are almost on a collision. When you read this paper on the RMA, the opportunities for change, it basically identifies every problem with the RMA that ever existed since it came in, and pros and cons of that. It is an enormous bit of work to get through that, and the reason I asked that question earlier was the uncertainty it's going to provide or create for us is you can't underestimate that, knowing what will come out of it in the end. And at the same time as we're trying to fix the RMA, we're doing a bill that is giving these enormous powers to Kaingora, which I'm not particularly opposed to in some situations, because you do have to get through some of this stuff and get things done in order to address what we all are concerned about as affordable housing, especially in the city. And then alongside that comes the issues of biodiversity, which are important, and as our staff have said, perhaps don't recognise what we have been doing, or how difficult it is sometimes to get that into rules and regulations that don't end up with unintended consequences, like we talked about with the sand dunes. So I'm happy to recommend all these, and as Councillor Hollis said, support our staff as they represent us in interfacing with government. Tragically, select committees don't always adopt the very good recommendations from the people who are at the coalface doing stuff. Let's hope that changes as these bills go through their process of iteration and change. Other speakers, Councillor Hughes and then Councillor Arbery.
I just have one comment on the biodiversity submission. I do believe that submission should come from the Natural Habitats team, not from the planning team, with comments from, including comments from the planning team, rather than the other way around, as they are the experts and they're here about the biodiversity, and that's their field. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Arbery.
Just a request to vote on the biodiversity submission separately.
Last speaker, I think, Councillor Robson, if you wish to.
Yeah, there is an issue here, and it we're coming into an annual plan process. There's going to be discussion about, you know, the burden that the people of the city carry by virtue of funding their council, but the sort of ill-disciplined production of policy statements out of a government that doesn't seem to be able to do joined-up thinking imposes an enormous impost effectively on the ratepayers. We have highly skilled people trying to find their way through a maze of ill-thought-out proposals. And at some point, you know, I'd like to see LG&Z take a more productive role in sort of encouraging government to do more work before it speaks. They seem to be a central government seems to be frequently speaking without thinking and asking other people to tidy up the consequence. And the burden for us is enormous, and we're already stretched in terms of resource. At some point there needs to be a challenge made. I do believe that local government does have a role in terms of not just implementing what they're ordered to by central government, but challenging it on behalf of the residents. We have that role, that advocacy role. And I think too often we spend too much time and energy sort of, if you like, collaborating with a process that actually, while perhaps driven by good intent, is actually really ill thought out, and the unintended consequences are quite disastrous. And you only have to look at the headlines in recent papers. I noticed a headline this morning around the gang issue. To me, the gang issue shouldn't be getting the headlines that it's getting, but certainly yesterday's, I think it was, headline around the housing issues in this city. You know, if we start overlaying all the constraints imposed by central government, we won't be building anything anywhere. We need to get some balance in this conversation. Central government have a role, and the resources, I might add, to actually produce a better foundation for going forward than they're currently delivering.
Thank you. Right of reply, Councillor Hollis. If there are no other speakers. May make a speech. You may.
Yeah, so on the biodiversity, I will be voting against. I was largely agreed with the report. There's parts of it that I don't agree with, so I quite like the idea of having a nice stock take of our biodiversity and having better protection in place, particularly for some other councils that aren't doing such a good job.
Okay, thank you. Right of reply, Councillor Hollis. No. So I'll put the motion. All those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Sorry, on A, the RMA management systems, please say aye.
Aye.
Against? Carried. And B, the National Policy Statement of Indigenous Biodiversity. All those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Against? Carried. Okay, we have two opposed. Councillor Abry, Councillor Hughes. Those in favour, I assume from a raising of hands, Mayor Powell, Councillor Clout, Councillor Robson, Councillor Kiddig, Councillor Hollis, Councillor Salisbury, and myself. Thank you. And now to C, endorsing the draft submission of the Urban Development Bill. All those in favour, please say aye. Aye. That is unanimous. Thank you. Okay, those recommendations are passed. We'll move to the next item of business, 8.2, which will take us to having Alistair Talbot come to the table. Page 83 of our agenda. The Waka Kotahi New Zealand Transport Agent Arataki document feedback. Thank you, Alistair.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, all. So the purpose of this paper is to present proposed staff feedback on Waka Kotahi New Zealand Transport Agency's Arataki document. The agency describe Arataki as their 10-year view of what's needed to deliver on the government's current priorities and long-term outcomes for the land transport system. This is the first version of further iterations and updates. This version has been developed by the agency alone, and this is their first engagement outside of their organisation on what it contains and the direction it identifies. We've reviewed the document since it was released in late December and identified a number of matters which we think could add value to the document. The intent of the document is supported, but there's a number of gaps and improvements which we think would add value to its purpose as described by the agency. Those sort of higher level points which we've identified as potential response points are identified in the paper, and they relate to the role and purpose of Arataki in relation to other key processes that the agency are responsible for, and the key one at the moment is their proposed investment decision-making framework review. How does this document relate to the technical work that is establishing, and where does it sit within their decision-making framework? We're also seeking clarification of the role of Arataki in relation to other planning processes that are far more detailed, comprehensive and partnership-based, like the Urban Form and Transport Initiative that will provide us with a true partnership evidence base and direction to go forward. The two other key high-level points which we've identified, which we think Arataki should recognise and discuss, one relates to housing demand and supply. The document at the moment is really quite silent on the key relationship between transport and housing demand and supply, and we suggest that should be something that's picked up and discussed in Arataki. And the third one is around freight movement, and particularly the Port of Tauranga. Freight movement, key role for the land transport system, and the evidence to really support and understand how that then is affecting different parts of the country, and particularly the Upper North Island and Western Bay and Tauranga in particular is lacking. We suggest that if Arataki is to deliver on its purpose as described by the agency, then that should be a piece of evidence that sort of underpins the document. We've also had discussions with the Regional Council. They're preparing a draft submission on Arataki on behalf of the Regional Transport Committee. The matters we've identified are consistent with the matters they've identified, and we're liaising to ensure we are aligned. So that's a brief summary.
Great, thank you, Alistair. Any questions of that? Was anyone else surprised when they saw Arataki and thought this was all about a particular interchange? All right. Questions?
Yeah, sorry, just a comment. I appreciate that you picked up on the housing affordability.
All right, someone happy to move? Councillor Robson, Councillor Clout seconded. Councillor Robson to speak.
Yeah, I think this is a good response to, again, another document that seems to emanate from this time a central government agency that doesn't seem to put the necessary thought in. And I particularly like the detail and the further feedback in the report. I do note, however, with some irony, that the requested information in attachment to further feedback under key drivers, I imagine could have been drafted by just about every stakeholder in the current AFTI process, because when they look at the reports and look for the supporting information and data and analysis that they want to get to understand it. So I'm a little bit concerned that people outside this organisation may hurl the epithet hypocrites at us That is not to say we are wrong in this case. I believe that we are wrong in the AFTI situation of not providing a similar level of information. It's a good response to another, as I say, central government agency inspired piece of, as you say, we can't even identify clearly where it fits in all the other documents produced by that agency. But, I do think we need to look at the sort of things that we're engaged in and make sure we hold ourselves to the same standard that we'd like NZTA to work with, and I think we're falling short of that at the moment. So thank you, and thank you for the mirror.
Thank you, Councillor Clout.
Yeah, thanks very much, Alistair, for you and your team putting the effort into this. I appreciate the link you've made to housing demand and supply, and also the importance of freight movements to and from the Port of Tauranga. So that's really important for our city. I also appreciate that you've linked in with the Bay of Plenty Regional Council, and that we're singing from the same song sheet. So long may that last. Thank you.
Other speakers? Okay, write a reply. I'll put the motion or the recommendation, which is we receive the report and endorse the proposed feedback to the Transport Agency on its Arataki project. All those in favour, please say aye. Against? That is carried unanimously. Thank you very much, everybody, for your attendance at this committee meeting. We will now call the committee meeting closed.